Hello, mate. Thrive. It's all about neurological conditions, and 25 years of practice, I've never seen what's happened to the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system. There's a mental health illness epidemic like never before, and brain fog and ADHD and just concentration issues is exponentially increasing from corporates to children. It's really a huge concern. In fact, it's my greatest concern because it affects every single part of the human body. And so it's a real privilege to have Dr. Robert Melillo on the show. He's a functional neurologist, he's a clinician, he's an author of incredible books. He's developed the Melillo method. He's trained thousands of people all over the world. And that's why it's very close to my heart, having lectured over 12,000 medical professionals. The only way we can change more lives is to bring awareness firstly and then educate. So it's an absolute privilege. He's a health legend. Please, we'll put all the links to his websites, his training, his TED Talk. And I've known him for a while, having interviewed quite a few functional neurologists in the States. It's a warm welcome to have you on the show, Dr. Robert Melillo.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Brilliant. We do want to get the awareness out into Africa, although a lot of our listeners are in the US. Just give us the current status as you see it, because I've just never seen so many children and adults diagnosed with ADHD. Let's talk about two main subjects. I think ADHD, and then the second part of it will be ASD, autism spectrum disorders. But let's start with just what's happening in modern day cities. I'm not talking people who live on a farm and live on an organic pasture that have different types of lives to you and me. You're in New York City, I'm in Johannesburg, and we've seen dysfunction at another level. It's starting earlier, and it's starting to show in adulthood, with more and more adults being given Ritalin and Strattera and these type of things, Concerta and Vyvanse. It's just it's crazy on my side, but just maybe give us an intro. What's happening with the current status of neurological conditions?
Yeah, I mean, they're exploding. I mean, we're seeing an epidemic, as you said, like never before, especially in childhood. But, what happens in early development of the child's brain ultimately is the fate of the adult brain. So, this epidemic has really been increasing dramatically over the past 30 years. So many of the children that were children at the beginning of this epidemic are now adults. And many of them have diagnoses like ADHD or schizophrenia or OCD or bipolar disorder. And they're all basically the same thing. We know that almost all adult mental health issues really start in childhood. And so, what is driving all of this? And my third book was really all about this. It's these epigenetic factors, meaning that, most of all of these issues, whether they're childhood behavioral, neurobehavioral issues or adult mental health issues, we know that the vast majority of them, 95%, are not because of a genetic mutation of any kind. That they are what we call epigenetic, which means that certain genes may not be being turned on when they should, and 85% of our genes are there to build the human brain, and that various environmental factors, preconception, in the womb, and then post-conception, can all converge on the genes and affect their expression and ultimately affect the development and the timing of development of the brain. And depending on how that timing is disrupted, can lead to certain developmental imbalances that can cause different symptoms or behaviors that some may be recognized early, like autism may be recognized typically before the age of 3 or 4, ADHD usually by 6 or 7, dyslexia, learning disabilities usually by the end of 10, 11, 12, schizophrenia by the 20s, bipolar may not develop till the 30s, but the human brain is developing probably up until 50 years old when it's still myelinating. So we can have developmental issues that show up in the 40s and 50s with anxiety or other types of things. So, we're seeing all of this rise, and because the brain does everything, we also see this rise of autoimmune diseases and other illnesses, and all of it is being driven primarily by lifestyle. And it's all the same thing that's driving an obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular, cancer epidemic is also driving these neurological issues.
Okay, but is that happening in utero? So if someone's listening, it happening, when conception happened, and it's happening while the babies are in utero. Are these environmental factors? I had Stephanie Seneff on the show, this glyphosate specialist, saying, 1 in 20 kids in New Jersey is, on the ASD spectrum. And it's because of glyphosate and this toxicity that's coming as a chelator, and it's causing major micronutrient problems and macronutrient problems. What are the major things that are causing neurological issues early on?
Yeah, so some of these actually are preconception. In fact, probably most of them are preconception factors that actually can methylate the genes and inhibit gene expression. And so in my book, I identified about 50. So my third book is called Autism, the Scientific Truth of Diagnosing, Treating, and Preventing Autism Spectrum Disorder, but it deals with more than autism. And so what we do know is that, there are certain fairly well documented things like glyphosate or other types of pesticides that will elevate the risk, right? So that elevates the risk of having a child with autism by about 150%. We know that other things like phthalates or other, BPA or other types of toxins in the environment can have it. We know that pollution, if you're in a city, then you're exposed to this pollution. But if you're in a farm, you may be exposed to pesticides more. So all of those play factors, as does age of the mom and the dad, as does many other things. There's no one thing that is, that's the thing there. But what it does is it can alter gene expression. It causes methyl molecules to be produced. And this is the process of epigenetics. And then that is going to interfere with different processes during development. As I said, 85% of our genes, and the most environmentally sensitive genes we have are the ones that govern brain development, because the human brains are designed to be that way. Our brain is shaped mostly outside of the womb. So the genes that regulate that are, give our brain the most adaptability of any brain, but also the most susceptibility to environmental factors. So all of those things are affecting that, but it doesn't cause brain damage. There's no damage. There's no injury. The way when people refer to autism as a brain injury, it's not an injury. There may be inflammation in their body and all of those things, but all of that is initiated and regulated by the brain.
Okay, brilliant. So people are listening and they're just about to have a child. What are probably the 2-3 most important things that they can do to try and prevent something like an ADHD with their kids, which is just so prevalent, or ASD, autism spectrum disorder?
I think, first thing they should do is get really good blood work to look up, like what's happening within their immune system. Looking at their white blood cells. Do they have anemia? Do they have chronic inflammation in their body? Do they have any dysregulation of their own immune markers? What we call Th1 and Th2, and looking at some of those things, looking at their natural killer cells. And, because imbalances within the immune system is something that can trigger chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation is a big issue and has a big impact on gene expression and brain development. So looking at that, measuring those markers is important. Looking at our overall health. Again, if we have food sensitivities and anything that may trigger more inflammation. I think also physical health of being strong, feeling our body, connecting our body. But I think the single most important thing you can do is look to see if you yourself have this kind of brain imbalance. What we see is that there are genetic traits that are more susceptible to having a child with autism or bipolar or schizophrenia. What I look at is people. I just had a couple in here with me today. They're both software engineers. And we know the most common occupation of a child with autism or neurodiversity or ADHD is parents that have an engineering background. And what does that mean? It means they're very left brain dominant people. They're very highly intelligent, very intellectual. Contrary to what people probably think, we know that statistics show clearly that as you go up the socioeconomic scale, the more money you make, the better educated you are, the more likely you are to have a child with ADHD or autism. It's not something that comes about because of neglect and because people that are left brain dominant, we're living in a more and more left brain dominant world, and that is more desirable trait. And they tend to do better academically. They go to better schools, they get better jobs, and they make more money. But if they pass those genes on, and if they're not developing the right brain the way they're supposed to, then this is one of the things that can contribute significantly to autism. So being aware of their own brain style, being aware if they have any balances, being aware if they have retained primitive reflexes, I think is the single most important thing they can do.
Sure, which means they need an assessment from someone who's a functional neurologist. So that's really important. If you're listening out there, I think an assessment from a functional neurologist is going to be absolutely key, but we'll get into that. Doc, do you have the rates of ADHD? It just seems that they're exponentially increasing, or even ASD. You know, what are the rates in modern day cities now with these two conditions?
Yeah, so 30 years ago or so, like when I was a kid or, young man, we saw that, autism was diagnosed probably 1 in 10,000. It's now 1 in 36 in the United States or 1 in 24 boys. And remember, when we get statistics, they're already 2 or 3 years old, right? Meaning because these are statistics from like 2 years ago. The real statistic right now is we're probably with autism in the United States at about 1 in 20 kids. And overall, we're looking at about 1 in 4 children in the United States are diagnosed with some level of disability. ADHD is, makes up about 10 to 11% of the population. Dyslexia and learning disabilities makes up about 15 to 20% of the population of kids and adults. So all of these things are increasing, and there's a very high comorbidity, meaning that if you have ADHD or autism, you probably have some form of OCD, you may have some form of tic disorder, and you probably have some form of autoimmune issue going on as well.
Yeah, and then you look at gut dysfunction and people keep on treating the gut, but it's a central nervous system issue or neurological issue or developmental issue. You might have a methylation problem or you're not absorbing things, and the central nervous system has to be assessed. Am I right?
Yeah, and that's an important point you brought up, because when you said seek out a functional neurologist, people may not know what's the difference between, let's say, functional neurology and functional medicine. And there is a big difference. Because functional medicine, they're trained well in looking at the biochemistry, they're looking at the biomedical system, hormones, and that type of thing. But they don't know anything about the brain, most of them. They have no clue. And they think that everything starts in the gut. It starts with inflammation, and then that goes to the brain, and that's the cause. That's the root cause of autism and ADHD, and it's not. Functional neurology, we know the brain better than anybody, but we also know functional medicine. Most doctors in functional neurology are also fully trained in functional medicine, and so we understand both aspects. And that's why you need somebody that can really assess your brain and brain development. And it really comes down to, a lot of it is looking at the balance of your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. Because really, when you have an increase in the sympathetic dominance and a decrease in parasympathetic, that is really probably the single main factor. We wrote a paper in 2009 that showed that by understanding sympathetic dominance and parasympathetic delay, and how that is also related to hemispheric imbalances, and you could explain every single thing in the biomedical world, right? So every problem, from lack of digestive enzymes or not enough acid in the stomach or poor digestion or leaky gut or Th1, Th2 imbalances, or all of that can be explained by the sympathetic being dominant and parasympathetic. So that's another key thing to measure. And as we know, the main measure of that is looking at things like heart rate variability. But that is all related to how the brain is regulating, and that is what creates the digestive problem and the leaky gut and the poor digestion and the inflammatory increase and the anti-inflammatory decrease. So it all comes from the brain stem, and the balance of that sympathetic and parasympathetic.
Okay, maybe you want to just unpack sort of the right and the left, and you've seen sort of this imbalance between the two. I think my viewers and the audience knows a lot about the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, measuring heart rate variability. We've got a huge corporate business that we look at executives and we get them to measure their heart rate variability. We monitor, look at trends, look at interventions like breath work and cold plunges and saunas to try and help improve that parasympathetic state. But maybe explain just how the hemispheres work, because I think that's very novel that the audience might not know.
Yeah, it's very important because, again, it's really about the whole system. And ultimately, it's about the parasympathetic and sympathetic systems. It's not just about stimulating the vagus nerve. And so the way the brain works is that, human brains are asymmetric, meaning that the right brain and the left brain are very different. And that's the way they're designed to be. And that is a great advantage. More than any other animal. So as you go up the animal kingdom scale, we know that the more intelligent the animal, the more asymmetric their brain is. So it's like having two brains in one, and it's very important. Ian McGilchrist, who's a really well-known psychiatrist out of UK, has done a good description where he said, why do you need two different attentional systems in the brain? Well, an animal, let's say like a bird, is looking for a seed on the ground amongst pebbles. They need to have very highly focused attention, detailed attention. But at the exact same time, they need to have a broad, open attention looking for predators that are going to kill them. That they need to do both at the same time. And you can only do that if you have two hemispheres doing different things. And so, that is a very important thing. How does that happen? It starts really in the womb. So in the womb, we have genetic mechanisms that cause our right brain to come online first. So our right brain is more active in the womb and for the first 3 years. Then the left brain comes on after that. In the first 3 years, we're, in the womb, we're being bombarded by, muffled sound and not a lot of light. We're not seeing things clearly. We're not speaking. We don't understand words, but we do hear and we do see and we do feel things. And we get basic foundational feelings that develop in our body and in our right brain. There's an area called the right insula where we have interoception. So right from the beginning, a baby needs to be able to tell their parents if they're in pain, if they're hungry, if they're thirsty, if they're hot, cold, need to be changed, if they're tired. And smell and taste are involved with that. So all of this is developing in the right brain. The right brain is primarily driven from the beginning by human attachment, by attachment to other people and other living things. So that nonverbal social communication that is built on top of our feelings. We feel, we sense our body, and we have interoception and proprioception, and we become embodied in the right brain at around the age of 2. We fully become embodied. And then we use that to read that on other people. We learn how to regulate our own emotions. We learn how to regulate our autonomic system, and we activate our parasympathetic system to slow down our heart rate, promote digestion. All of that is happening in the right brain. The right brain gives the big picture. The right brain has understanding. The right brain is wisdom. The right brain is really the more intelligent brain. It actually synthesizes a lot of information simultaneously at the same time, very quickly. It doesn't form conscious memories and it doesn't have words, but it does stimulate conversation. The reason why we want to talk to somebody, the reason why we want to connect. So in autism, one of the biggest things we see is that right from the beginning, many of these kids are not approaching small children. They're not interested in other people. They're not interested in conversing with them. They're not feeling their body. They have very low interoception, and they have very low parasympathetic system. The left brain comes online after 3 years, and it's mainly about remembering details. We start to remember things. The left brain is more about, taking in data, analyzing data and facts and remembering it and organizing it and sequencing it and categorizing it and then using it to go after a goal. The left brain is more goal directed. The left brain does use more speech. The left brain is more about, using fine motor skill, and the left brain is more about, emotions like anger and pride and happiness, where the left brain generates emotions like sadness or fear or sense of danger, embarrassment, shame, guilt, empathy, love, and attachment. And so, that's a general overview of the way the two hemispheres develop, but obviously it's even much more complex than that.
Sure, I think that gives a good summary. But basically, what happens is there's no balance between the two. And, I started as a physical therapist, and what I've just seen from neurodevelopment therapists, whether they're occupational therapists or physical therapists, it doesn't seem to progress. Even looking at the primitive reflexes, it doesn't seem to get to the root causes. Now, that's a generalization. Things could have changed significantly, but it seems like the functional neurology is different because you stimulate top down and bottom up, which I think is crucially important to help the balance of this. Maybe you can speak about the balance between the right and left, and then talk about why it's so important. I see there's lasers. You've got lasers on your website, and it looks like you've got a transcranial electrical device. Why does it seem that your average therapist out there is not getting breakthrough, and these kids and let's talk about ADHD, they seem to have to go onto the Ritalins or the Concertas or the Strateras. They don't seem to break through, especially in ADHD.
Yeah, well, I think, the first question I ask parents when they come in here is, has anybody explained what's actually happening in your child's brain? And the answer is almost always no. And so the average practitioner out there, or I would say, almost all practitioners out there, unless people that have really been trained at the highest level of functional neurology, really don't understand the core issue. And they're just managing symptoms. So, as we talked about, the brain builds from the bottom up. It starts from the brainstem, from the medulla, where all the autonomic nuclei are, and that's also where what we have primitive reflexes come from. And so the brain, as we said, the right brain is developing first. So we have what's called vertical integration, so bottom up, and then the brain builds, and then it comes top down and it regulates everything. But at the same time, we have this horizontal integration. We have the right brain developing, taking the lead first, and then the left brain. And that's the way it's supposed to happen. Anything that deviates from that, especially within the first year, may cause a difference in that timing. And so like in autism and ADHD, what we typically see is, right from the beginning, there may be an issue in the womb. They may not be in the right position. They may not be there. The mom may not be progressing in the birth. They may not come through the birth canal. They may have a C-section. They may miss or skip or have truncated milestones. The bottom line is, at 12 months, almost exactly, all children should be able to walk a few steps, talk a few words, and have good eye contact and pointing. And at that point, these primitive reflexes should now be inhibited, and now they should go on to the next level, and that builds the bottom up and then top down. But at the same time, again, the right brain is on first and then the left brain. What we've found, and we've shown in our research, that if the primitive reflexes don't go away, and we see that these milestones aren't met the way they're supposed to, that it holds back brain development, and it keeps the brain in a more immature state, and especially can have more of an impact on the right brain during that development. And then in kids that are naturally gifted in the left brain, that left brain comes online too early, and then that pushes that right brain down. And that's where we see that regression sometimes in kids. And sometimes it happens before one, sometimes it happens later. But the level of that regression is often related to when that left brain comes on and it holds that right brain down. And now the left brain fully kicks in around, 2.5, 3. And that's when we also may see a big regression in kids, and where kids stop, responding to their name. They may not have, lose eye contact, or they start walking on their toes or stimming or all of that. And so all of the symptoms in that situation is because the left brain came online too early and it's too strong, and the right brain is delayed and it didn't fully mature and develop. And then we can have the opposite relationship as well too. And all of that regulates also the parasympathetic and the sympathetic and the immune system. So the left hemisphere promotes the sympathetic, it promotes the immune system reaction and sensitivity of antibodies and white blood cells, and it also promotes inflammation. The right hemisphere promotes the parasympathetic, inhibiting the immune system and anti-inflammatory cytokines and systems like the HPA axis.
Okay, brilliant. So now we got to stimulate the right part of the brain, this parasympathetic nervous system. It sounds like that's the most important to get some type of integration. So what are the latest tools and assessments? Do you do QEEGs? Do you do the SPECT scan? How do you what measurements do you do to see the progression?
Yeah, again, we like to use as much objective measurements as we can. There aren't a lot of good objective measurements under the age of 5, to be honest, anywhere. So really it comes down to a really good neurological exam. And then we do some lab tests. We do blood tests, and we're looking at things like food sensitivities and antibody responses. We do look at, a T-B cell breakdown, and we look at, some other bloods possibly, and looking for like antibodies against the brain and the nervous system. But then when, someone is above 5 or 6, we like to get objective measurements. We, again, are looking at bottom-up stuff. So are the primitive reflexes there? What does their muscle tone look like? Do they have any tilts or body tilts or asymmetry in muscle tone? What does their balance look like? We look at, what's their inner ear function? How are their eye movements? We do, computer programs that look at eye movement, and we look at vision and visual processing. We look at hearing and auditory processing. We look at smell, very important. We will use cognitive measurements of either an academic achievement test like the Wyatt. If it's an adult, we'll do a battery of neurocognitive tests that look at attention and memory and things like that. We do QEEG on almost anybody over the age of 6 or 7 if they can. And we have a really cool new QEEG machine that really breaks it down into right and left, I think better than others have. We also look at interactive metronome and timing and coordination and rhythm. So we try to use as much objective tests. Parents fill out checklists and behavioral checklists as well that give us a window. And this is true for adults as well too. We work with all age groups. So we use those objective measurements along with our exam. And what we find is that, we're seeing, we can identify this. So like if we look at something like an academic achievement, we look at things like reading comprehension and math problem solving, which are more right brain skills, or word reading level, or basic math operations, which are more left brain skills. So, the checklist, a good history, the exam, and then whatever objective measurements we can, along with some level of lab work, is what we do pretty much baseline on everybody.
Brilliant. Okay, so then you do the assessments. It's obviously unique and it's personalized to every single patient that comes there. Then in terms of the top-down and the bottom-up approach, because I think that's the sort of unique secret sauce here of the stimulating the right brain as well as doing the movement, because I think there's a lot of movement specialists doing good work out there. I just don't see it, and maybe you can talk about your success rate with ADHD especially. I mean, ASD is a spectrum, and that can be sort of hard to quantify, but tell us about your sort of the uniqueness of the multimodal method of the Melillo method.
Yeah, well, what we're trying to do when we assess the brain also is literally trying to identify what areas of the brain are overactive and what are underactive. And we can do that in a pretty high way, even with the QEEG. We can literally look at different Brodmann areas or different neuroanatomical points. And we look at things like when somebody has ADHD, the hyperactive motor component of it is really generated by an area called Brodmann area 6, or the supplemental premotor area of the frontal lobe on the left, and its relationship to something called the basal ganglia and the direct pathway. It's the same area that generates tics or repetitive movement or stimming behavior. The right hemisphere in that same area has what we call for the indirect or hyperdirect pathway, inhibits those areas of the brain. When we look at OCD, obsessions come more from overactivity of the left dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. The orbital frontal cortex is more related to compulsive behavior. We know that emotional dysregulation, anger, tantrums, aggression, self-aggression is also generated by more of those prefrontal networks. We know that there are these verbal and nonverbal communication networks that involve, the ability to read nonverbal communication on the right side with things like Brodmann area 39, which looks at the body, or Brodmann area 40, which looks at facial expression, or Brodmann area 22, which hears tone of voice. So we're being very specific, but again, all these things emerge from the bottom up first, right? So the brain literally has to grow and emerge. And in the brainstem, there are these seeds when we're born that will, when they're watered properly with the proper sensory stimulation and feedback from muscles and the proper nutrients, these seeds grow up and then flower in the brain. Right? So we get different areas of our brain that is like an apple and an orange and a banana that all start in the brainstem. And we may have a red apple on the right and a green apple on the left. They're both apples, but they're different. And so if we don't have the bottom up stimulation, that doesn't work. And it's like trying to water flowers when the flowers haven't come out of the ground yet, right? It's like trying to, do things when you're doing only top-down approaches, which is what many therapies do. When you're doing just neurofeedback or lasers or transcranial of any kind, those are great tools. But if you're doing them only as a top-down, because they're top-down, they're not bottom-up. And so if you're only doing that, and the foundation and the bottom-up and these seeds haven't started to grow through the top, it's not going to work very well. You may get some temporary changes, but that's why we do both at the same time. We're growing from the ground up, but then we're also giving sunlight and water to make sure we're getting these things growing, but we're also achieving the balance. So understanding that, getting rid of these primitive reflexes, which I think is the number one thing that prevents this vertical integration, that's what holds back movement and motor activity and sensory activation and creates asymmetries. And then also understanding that we need to balance out the right and left hemisphere by activating one side in certain areas as specifically as we can, and then inhibiting the other. And we need to respect that even things like brain waves and brainwave frequencies, that there's a developmental trajectory to that. So if we're trying to change brainwaves, whether through neurofeedback or transcranial or looking at the use of lasers, we have to know that, an adult brain doesn't have the same brainwave configuration as a 2-year-old or as a 4-year-old, that there are different levels of that, and that we have to, use what's appropriate for their age of development.
Okay, so just a practical example is like you would do a movement with a kid or an adult, firstly assess their perimeter, then you would do a movement, and at the same time you would put, say, laser or a transcranial stimulation on the right-hand side, and then do the movement at the same time, or the therapy is different. How does that sort of work?
Yeah, if we're doing, what we want to do is we want to get rid of the primitive reflexes. And again, especially with kids with right brain deficits who really lack interoception and proprioception. They don't feel their body. They can't control their body. And we look at it. You see a kid that's stimming like crazy or can't speak. It's not because of a left brain deficit. Again, a lot of my research, and I think one of the most important discoveries I've made over the past few years has been, why don't kids with autism speak? No one's ever really answered that question. And I think I have answered it better than anybody else has before. And we wrote a paper about it last year. And it's really not because they don't have the words. Many of these kids are hyperlexic. They read early. They're very early on interested in numbers and letters, and they have a phenomenal memory for landmarks and different things. Their left brain skills are there, even in kids that it doesn't seem like they know things or know how to read. They do, right? They're all basically geniuses with their left brain. but their right brain is so disconnected in many of them, they don't have really a sense of pain. They may not feel their body, and they so disconnected that their right insula isn't developed, and they don't have what we call body ownership. They don't really become embodied. And they tell us this, and they've written books about this, that they don't feel their body, that they can't control their body, but they know everything. And they can't speak because they can't control those muscles of speech, but that's because they don't feel their body. They'll tell us literally that my tongue is numb. I don't feel my tongue. I don't feel my body. I don't know where my body is. They haven't created maps in their brain, somatotopic maps. And you can't plan a movement with a part of your body that you don't feel. And that's the main driver of nonverbal communication and also the lack of communication. So, we're doing things that are very directed towards getting them to feel their body, but trying to get them to do complex exercises to get rid of the primitive reflexes. They don't know where their body is, and we're going to try to get them to do complex movement. It doesn't work. So one of the things that I realized and I developed was we stimulate the reflexes for them, just like we would test them. We don't expect them to do a lot of complex movement in the beginning because they can't. And so we're using reflexes to get them to do like automatic sit-ups, or get them to do like hand walking, or get them to do different kind of rolling responses. But then we're stimulating their reflexes for them. At the same time, we're bombarding them with different types of sensory stimulation directed specifically to the right brain, but quieting down the left, because the left brain it's so strong it won't allow that right brain to come up. So that's when we bring in like lasers, and that's when we bring in transcranial, which can inhibit one side and activate the other, while we're doing this bottom-up stimulation with light and sound and smells and movement and vestibular input and all of those things. So we're doing that all in combination, leading them through these different developmental stages.
Sure. Sounds very, very comprehensive. And do you have any sort of success rates? I know ASD can be quite tricky, but in terms of ADHD, what is your sort of success rate? Someone comes through, when I say success, they're not taking pharmaceutical drugs, and they are able to regulate themselves within a classroom and be able to be functional in terms of their growth and development academically and physically. What type of success rate are you getting, Dr. Robert?
Yeah. We're actually just developing a software that's going to really more accurately collect this data for us. And we have published some studies. We published a study years ago looking at ADHD and not using the sophistication of this program, but more what I created with what I called the brain balance method, which was a more, simpler model. And we showed that we were able to get about change by using ADHD scales. We were able to get people into not being diagnosed with ADHD any longer in about 80% of the cases in about the first 3 to 4 months. But I think that our success rate is much higher than that. Obviously, we have a much more comprehensive model. And the brain balance model for ADHD and things like that is good, but that was, I designed that for kids, and I designed it for pretty high functioning people. But what we work with really is looking at more severe things like ASD. And it's hard to, look at that measurement, but I will say that in virtually all of the kids that we work with are adults. Our goal on average is that we get rid of these reflexes within the first 8 to 12 months. And along with that, we're also seeing that most of the kids that are non-speaking, about 80% of them are speaking by the end of that first year. Many of them are completely off the spectrum, or they don't fit the criteria any longer. I would say, our success rate for ADHD is very, very high. I mean, there's almost, I don't want to say 100%, but it's pretty close to that. And that's obviously dependent on the parents or the individual patients and what they do. If they follow through and they do what we tell them, we have a very, very high success rate. With every kid we work with on the spectrum, we're getting significant changes, and we usually see those changes within the first week or two. We're seeing changes in interoception, in their appetite, in their sensitivity to pain, in their emotional state, maybe even in their verbal and nonverbal communication and their attachment. We see changes right away with those kids, and that just progresses, and we see autonomic changes. And, so it's a very, very high success rate, I think, in not only improvement, but even in also getting these people to no longer fit that diagnosis.
Well done to you. That's absolutely incredible with those stats and that. Is there a reason why and I know you've lectured and educated thousands all over the world, that is not growing significantly? Because it just seems like I just said, I've got a 20-year-old son and I've got an 8-year-old daughter. My son, when he was like 8 or 10, there was probably about 10 to 15% of his class getting therapies. Now my daughter is like 90% of the kids in her class are getting either physiotherapy, or they're getting occupational therapy, they're getting remedial therapy, or they're getting speech therapy. Why has it not propagated this top-down, bottom-up, and vertical integration, which it sounds like it's very, very holistic?
Yeah, I think, it starts with very few people, I think. And I don't want to sound, it's not about me. It's not about my ego. It's about basically saying that I think I understand the brain about as well as anybody in the world. And I don't think many people have put the combination of the clinical and research understanding and the years of experience in the brain. And so I think, most practitioners and most, schools out there, they're really not aware of what the core issue is. So they're looking at different symptoms, they're looking at different problems, and they're trying to address those things individually. You'll have, an OT may work on the vestibular system or fine motor work, or, maybe do primitive reflexes. You may get a PT that's working on maybe gross motor development or muscle tone or strength development. You may get a vision therapist working on oculomotor function. You get an auditory therapist working on sound, or speech therapist working on speech. You get a biomedical functional medicine working on biomedicine and nutrition. And all of them are dealing with these individual systems. And these have become accepted over the time, right? And we're using things like ABA, which would seem to make sense. Like, okay, a child can't behave a certain way, but let's teach them how to behave. Or a child can't read, and let's teach them to read by reading. It doesn't make sense if you understand neurologically what's happening and what the core problem is. But from the surface, it seems like it makes sense. And so those things have become more accepted, and they do get some results. And so that's the mainstream. Going against that is always takes time and difficulty, and you have to produce the research to really prove what you're saying. But I think we've come a long way in the last 20 years. I mean, the level of recognition now. I mean, if you look on Instagram, you'll see, all these references to primitive reflexes. And I believe that latest awareness over the past 5 years, that explosion is being driven by a lot of my work. I mean, I have almost 1 million followers on Instagram now. We have a web series that we've had over 4 million views of our web series in the last year, and we're the #1 show on this streaming network. Like you said, I've trained tens of thousands of practitioners with brain balance centers. We've worked with well over 100,000 kids, I think, in the United States alone. It is increasing. We're getting more and more. My third book just came out. My third edition of my book, Disconnected Kids, just came out in Germany this past couple of weeks. It's in 18 languages around the world. It's one of the best-selling books. My textbook that we came out with Springer came out 20 years ago. They just came up to us and said, that textbook is one of the best-selling books we've ever had as a textbook, and they want us to do a second edition of it. So over the next couple of years, we're going to come out with a second edition of our textbook. That's pretty rare that 20 years later, they're going to come out and say, your book now is more popular than it ever was before. So I think that it's growing. I think the awareness is growing, but it's a process and it takes time. Kevin James, a very famous actor here in the United States, was on Joe Rogan's podcast talking about me and how we helped his children, his daughter with autism, and helped get rid of her tics very significantly. That was a big thing. Obviously, Joe Rogan's voice is huge. So we're hoping to, get more people like that and more awareness. And, it's just a process, but we're gaining momentum. And I think this has a chance. We've just been invited. We actually produced a paper for one of the top clinical pediatric journals in the world that, is pretty conservative. And they've come to us and said, hey, we're hearing a lot about these primitive reflexes. What's going on? And we're tracing it back to you and your work. And we want you to write a paper on it. So we just did. We just submitted that paper, and that should be coming out soon. So I think we're starting to get some movement, I think.
Brilliant. Someone's listening now, and their kids got ADHD. They're doing the movement, maybe the bottom up approach, and they've seen some changes. Do they add hyperbaric oxygen therapy? Do they get a helmet with red light and infrared lasers to that? Well, what can they do? Do they order a transcranial device, from your site, something that can sort of help stimulate the brain? I mean, I had another functional neurologist on and said there's so many people out there, they're not stimulating the actual organ. So the movement's great and looking at the reflexes is great, but the stimulation on the actual organ's not happening. What would you say to a lot of South Africans or Africans or people around there that don't have, they've got an OT or PT that's doing it, but they don't have these other modalities?
Yeah, and I think that for me, I think where we're moving in neuroscience, and I have a PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience, so I'm a neuroscientist, and where we're moving in functional medicine and functional neuroimmunology, which is really a main area of my research and teaching now, is more towards being specific and directed rather than general stimulation or general inhibition, right? So, that's why people have to be careful with just looking at stimulating. I'm not a big fan of just putting a helmet on with lasers, because when you're dealing with an imbalance and you stimulate everything equally, you usually are going to make that imbalance worse, because you're going to stimulate the side that's more active more. And also, you have to look at, like, lasers, what are you doing? I mean, it is good in general for the brain. Don't get me wrong. I know metabolically it helps promote it, but it also changes brainwave frequencies. And if you do the wrong frequency at the wrong age in the wrong area of the brain, you can actually make things a lot more severe. Again, generalized exercise, generalized stimulation of music or light, I'm not a big fan of that, because again, it's superimposed on a system that's unbalanced and has a tendency to make it more unbalanced. So it's not just about the tool, it's not just about that, and it's not just about stimulating the brain. It's about removing what's holding it back, which is the primitive reflexes and core stability and movement, and then it's about creating the proper balance. So I think, really educating themselves. I think if they read my book, they get a really good background. We have our 3rd edition that just came out in August, so it's really updated with our research, and we have checklists in there. I think, again, obviously, same thing with the immune system. It's not just in traditional medicine with autoimmunity, it's just, let's just suppress everything. Or it's not just about boosting the immune system. It's about balancing out these Th1, Th2 systems, Th17, Th9. It's about really targeted therapy. So I think, doing a healthy lifestyle is very important. Getting kids to move, eating organic, eating healthy. But again, looking at food sensitivities, every kid is different. Just doing a generalized gluten and dairy-free diet, for me, isn't really that great, because there's a lot of kids out there that don't have sensitivities to dairy and gluten. And there's a lot of kids out there that have sensitivities to a lot of other things that you need to be aware of.
No, I got you. I mean, I hear the specificity and how important it is to be unique and personal. I got that. It's just like, let's say example, I get, from a functional medicine aspect, being here 18 years, I tell these moms, while you're doing the therapies, go and do hyperbaric. Being a game changer, huge game changer. for these kids, or get them into an infrared sauna, or when you set them outside, don't put a hat on them. You don't want direct UV, but get more infrared light. They're mal-illuminated. I mean, are there some generals like the hyperbaric or some oxidative therapies? I've just seen it, just in practice here, not from the research, but just seen it in practice here, helping a lot of these parents.
Yeah, a lot of the kids that I work with, because we get people from literally all over the world that have been everywhere, and many of them through the hyperbaric. Many of the parents say that it was definitely helpful. Some parents don't feel it really did much, but that varies, like with most modalities. I think obviously increasing oxygen is only really a good thing for the most part, especially for the brain, which uses 20% of all the oxygen in our body. And I think that especially if there is truly a brain injury, then I think it really has great benefit. I think absolutely, having them outside, being out in nature, moving their body, keeping them away from computers, not trying to, I don't think any kid should be on a screen, certainly before the age of 3, because most screens and the technology in them, like video games, and stimulate the left brain. We shouldn't be doing things like flashcards. We shouldn't be trying to get kids to read before the age of 3. No one should read before the age of 4. And we shouldn't even try to teach them before that. If they're reading before that, there's a problem, right? Usually. And that's called hyperlexia. And we almost only see that in autism. So, we need to be aware of that development. They should be outside playing, moving their body, feeling their body, building their muscle tone, interacting with other children. In the first 3 years, kids should be like little puppies. They should go up to kids. They should roll around and laugh and chase after one another and climb trees and ride bikes and do all those things. And that forms the foundation of the right brain and the insula and the parasympathetic nervous system and the social nonverbal communication networks. That's what they should be doing, and the right brain likes nature. It likes physicality. It likes spatial awareness. It likes, everything about being, creative and imagination and all of those things. And that's something that technology takes away. So certainly within the first 3 years, when the right brain is developing, no kid should be seeing any screen. Even just giving up, and I know parents do it all the time. Oh, it's no big deal if I just give them a phone. Don't do it. Just don't do it. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't do it at all. But again, be very wary of that. And if the child is left brain dominant, it's going to have even more of an impact. It's going to bring their left brain on stronger, and they're going to get addicted to it. But I would even say until really 6, I would prefer them not being on any computers or anything, really, until that period of time.
Just love your passion. I think that's crucially important. Just one last question now for adults that have struggled and gone onto these drugs now. I know they're going to go through the same assessment process, but just a message of hope for adults, because they're on all these drugs and they say, oh, I'm feeling so much better and I'm taking Ritalin, I can focus now. I know it starts from childhood, but they seem to have got through school and they had social friends and their parasympathetic seem to be quite functional. Is it a case of possible trauma that they've had to the brain? Is it a case of the use of other drugs that can cause imbalances between the hemispheres? Why do you think it seems to be just a lot more prevalent, even with adults that had a normal childhood or went to university or very social beings?
Well, what I always say, first of all, is that the people that are most gifted in an area of their brain are the most susceptible to an imbalance. So that's why I said, you go up the socioeconomic scale, you're more likely to have a child with an issue, and you're more likely yourself to have an issue, even though you may be highly functional or gifted, because there's an old saying that there's a thin line between genius and insanity, right? Why is that? Because it's all about this balance. If you're born with these genius level skills, you're more vulnerable to an imbalance. And so and these things have a developmental trajectory. Like I said, some may show up in the first 3 or 4 years, some in the first 6 or 7, some may not show up until their 20s, some may not show up until their 30s or 40s, but they go back to childhood. But the ones that are developmental what I find is that the adults that we work with that have retained primitive reflexes, it goes back to childhood. But there are some people that may have had a brain injury. There may be people that have had psychological trauma later on in life. There may be people that, had chronic infection or something, really bad that happened to them from a health standpoint. And those people don't have retained primitive reflexes usually. And so that this is something that happened later rather than something that was developmental. Mm-hmm. And even people that have a brain injury, I have a lot of my friends that work with people with brain injury, and they never look for primitive reflexes. They don't look to see, they don't understand what was the state of the brain before the injury, because that will also impact the recovery. And so, if they already had an imbalance and then added an injury on top of that, that may complicate it. They may have had a very subtle imbalance. So looking at not just if there are, symptoms or but look at how the person is gifted in something. If someone is unusually gifted in something, there's a really good chance that they're also struggling in another area, right? And so you want to really ask the right questions about that. And anybody can improve that. Anybody can get that better. People don't have to suffer. We don't have to have genius and insanity at the same time. We don't have to have people that have to be addicted to drugs. And we know that drugs doesn't really deal with the core issue. It may be helpful in managing symptoms, but there are always limits to it, and there's always side effects. And so the idea is to really always try to deal with the core issue. And I believe what we've talked about today is the core issue in almost all of these things.
Okay. We're coming to the end of the show. Just 3 tips for adults. Should they go and play pickleball or paddle to try and write a word with their non-dominant hand, play a musical instrument, possibly learn a word? Maybe 3 tips for someone listening out there who's an adult to help the integration between the right and the left.
Yeah, there's nothing that is more important than movement, right? Moving their body. Physically moving. If you can do something aerobic, but also really strength training. I mean, I think keeping your body physically strong and keeping your muscle tone tight, because the muscles are what feed the brain more than anything else. So movement, like the people doing Tai Chi or people doing dance lessons or runners or, but also try to do some strength training. Number one thing. Then, doing things cognitively, always pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone. There was a study on these nuns from Minnesota years ago that showed that they're the only people that have never had any signs, even in their 80s, 90s, and 100s, that they never got Alzheimer's. And what they found was they were always doing things. They taught school, they were learning lessons, they did their own mechanics, they fixed the house, they did the cooking, they were always learning new things, they would watch Jeopardy every night. They did things to activate their brain. Reading is such a great thing to do. But if you can do things that you're uncomfortable with, like you said, using your opposite hand, if you have trouble with your memory, doing memory things, don't always feed into the things you're good at. Really take yourself outside of your comfort zone and really interpersonal. Get away from the computer and get around people and really interact with people as much as you can, especially people you love.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Where can people find you? And do you do telemedicine and the courses that, I hope the chiropractors listening out there do Dr. Melillo's course, please. We need more functional neurologists. We need more people trained with the top down, bottom up, vertical integration. I've even got the words, Dr. Melillo. I'm learning slowly. But those listening need to do the courses. Where should they go? And do you do telemedicine?
Yes, go to my website, drrobertmelillo.com. All the information about what we do. Yes, we do a lot of virtual programs with people, both people that we see live and then we send them home. Everyone has a home program, no matter who. But we also do just virtual programs for people, and we're always developing that and making it more sophisticated. But, you know, there's an advantage to being seen in person because we can't really test primitive reflexes or things like that without being in person. For doctors or therapists or even some parents, we have a great course. We just completed our most recent course. It's available online. It's a certification fellowship course. It's 10 modules, about 150 hours, and it's all available online. I also have a neuroanatomy, a very advanced functional neuroanatomy course. That's 5 modules. That's really great. I also have a workshop on how to set goals and create a plan for yourself. I have my own, you know, vitamins that I've created. I have a podcast called the Melillo Method Podcast, Everything Brain. That's on Spotify and Apple. And now I just started with my daughter, who's a very successful singer-songwriter from Nashville. And she started a podcast with me called The Right Brain, WRITE, geared to the creative community and the right brain and right brain anxiety and all of those things that come along with that, like bipolar. And so that's available as well, too. And that's available everywhere. And then, of course, I have 8 best-selling books. I have a textbook, all of that. And then I've written over 100 papers at this point in time. And all of those are open access on Google Scholar or on PubMed. One of my students told me recently that if you put in primitive reflexes into PubMed, my paper comes up number 1.
Sure. Well done. It's an incredible career, and you've changed hundreds of thousands of people's lives. And so I just want to absolutely declare favor and blessing over you, that you would rise up in this calling, that you would keep on going. We need more, you know, proteges on the Melillo method, and a privilege to have met you. And hopefully we can just connect now. I can get your emails and that we can put the affiliate links and those things in place, because I think that's crucially important.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you for having me, Steve. It's really been a pleasure. And I'm so glad that people like you are out there, you know, bringing this information out there. Thank you.